The rope cut into Elena's wrists before she even understood what was happening. She woke to hands pulling her from her blankets, cold air hitting her skin, and the low murmur of voices that stopped the moment she opened her eyes. 4 men stood around her bed. She recognized all of them. She had grown up beside them, eaten meals with their families, laughed with their children in the summer fields. Now, none of them would look at her. "What is this?" she asked, her voice still thick with sleep. "What's going on?" No one answered. One of the men, a broad-shouldered guard named Garrick, took her arm and pulled her to her feet. She stumbled, still tangled in the sheet, and he did not slow down for her. "Garrick, you're hurting me. Tell me what's happening." He kept his eyes on the door. "The elders will explain." Outside, the sky was still a deep, bruised purple, the sun not yet risen. The village square was already full of people. More people than Elena had ever seen gathered at this hour. Torches burned along the stone path, throwing long shadows against the huts and the old meeting hall. Everyone was watching her. Some looked away when she caught their eyes. Others stared without shame, as if she were already something other than a person, something already gone. Elena searched the crowd for her family. She found her mother first, standing near the front with her arms wrapped tightly around herself, eyes red but dry, as if she had already finished crying somewhere private. Her father stood a step behind her mother, his jaw set, his gaze fixed on the ground. Neither of them moved toward her. "Mother," Elena said, and her voice cracked on the word. "Mother, what is this?" Her mother's lips pressed into a thin line. For a moment, something flickered across her face, something that might have been guilt, or might have been relief, that it was not one of her other children standing in the square with bound hands. Then she looked away too. That was when Elena understood, with a cold certainty that settled into her stomach like a stone, that this was not a mistake. Whatever this was, it had been decided. She was simply the last person to be told. The elders stepped forward from the meeting hall. 3 old men in gray cloaks whose faces Elena had known her whole life. Elder Corwin, the eldest of them, walked with a wooden staff, though everyone knew he did not need it for balance. He used it because it made people quiet when he tapped it against the stone. He tapped it now, 3 slow times, and the murmuring crowd fell silent. "Elena Voss," he said, and his voice carried easily across the square, practiced and steady, the voice of a man who had given difficult speeches before. "You have been chosen." "Chosen for what?" Elena demanded. She pulled against the rope at her wrists, though it did nothing but tighten the burn against her skin. "Somebody tell me what is happening. I have a right to know." Corwin did not answer her directly. Instead, he turned to address the crowd, as if her question had not been asked at all. "Tonight, at the edge of the Forbidden Mountain, we will give this pack's offering to the one who watches over us, as has been done before, as will be done again, until the debt is paid." A ripple went through the crowd. Some heads bowed. A few people made a strange gesture over their chests, something between a prayer and a plea for forgiveness. Elena's mouth had gone dry. "What debt? What are you talking about?" "Somebody explain this to me." It was a woman near the front, an older weaver named Hazel, who finally spoke, though she spoke quietly, as if she were afraid the elders would hear. "The cursed wolf, child. They're taking you to the cursed wolf." The words landed strangely in Elena's chest, half familiar and half impossible. She had grown up hearing stories about the cursed wolf, the monster said to live on the mountain that no one from the village ever climbed. Parents used the name to frighten children into obeying curfews. Old men told tales of it around fires, embellishing the details each time, until the creature in the stories had grown teeth as long as knives and eyes that could see through stone. Elena had always assumed it was exactly that. A story. A tool to keep children close to home after dark. She had never once believed she would be walked toward it herself, bound and barefoot, while the people who had raised her stood by and let it happen. "This is insane," she said, and she meant for her voice to sound strong, but it came out thin, shaking. "You can't just decide to send me off to feed some monster because of a bedtime story. My family is right there. Somebody stop this." But nobody moved. Not her mother, not her father, not the girls she had grown up with, not the boy she had once thought she might marry. They all simply watched, some with pity, some with something closer to relief. and none of them said a single word in her defense. Garrick tightened his grip on her arm. "It's time," he said quietly, almost gently, as if gentleness could make any of this easier to bear. "Don't make this harder than it has to be, Elena." "Harder for who?" she snapped. "For you? You're not the one being sent up a mountain to die." He didn't answer that either. None of them did. That silence, more than anything else, told her everything she needed to know about how this night was going to go. They marched her out of the square in a small procession, 4 guards surrounding her, the elders trailing behind, and a portion of the crowd following at a respectful distance, close enough to witness, far enough to pretend they had not truly taken part. The forest swallowed the torchlight almost immediately once they left the village path, and the trees rose up on either side like walls closing in. Elena walked because she had no other choice, her wrists raw, her bare feet finding every root and stone along the path. Fear was there, coiled tight in her chest, but underneath it, something else was beginning to stir. Anger. A sharp, clean sort of fury that made her lift her chin instead of letting her shoulders fall. If they were going to do this to her, she decided, she was not going to give them the satisfaction of watching her break. "You could at least tell me why," she said to Garrick, walking close enough that only he could hear her. "You've known me since I was 6 years old. You taught me how to skip stones on the river. Tell me why it's me." He was quiet for a long moment, long enough that she thought he might ignore her again. Then, in a low voice, without looking at her, he said, "It's always someone. This time, the elders chose you. Why me, and not someone else? Why not one of their own children?" Garrick's jaw tightened. "Because you don't have a mate yet. No young ones of your own. Because your family didn't fight hard enough to protect you when the elders came asking." He paused. "I'm sorry, Elena. I don't like this any more than you do. But when the elders decide, no one argues. Not since the last time someone tried." "The last time someone tried?" Elena's steps slowed despite herself. "What happened the last time?" Garrick's expression shuttered closed, like a door pulled firmly shut. "That's not my story to tell." Elena wanted to press him further, but one of the other guards, a younger man named Dorian, she barely knew, cut in from behind them. "Careful what you say, Garrick. Elders will have your hide if they hear you talking to her like this." Garrick fell silent after that, and Elena had no choice but to keep walking, her mind spinning through everything she had just heard. There was more to this than a debt paid to a monster in the mountains. There was history here, buried history, the kind people were afraid to speak about even in whispers. The path narrowed as the trees grew older and taller, their trunks so wide it would have taken 3 grown men to circle them with linked arms. The air grew colder, and a strange quiet settled over the forest, the kind of silence that felt deliberate, as if even the birds and insects knew better than to make noise here. "How much farther?" Elena asked, more to break the silence than because she truly wanted an answer. "Not far," said the elder, walking nearest to her, a thin, sharp-faced man named Edwin. He had said little the entire walk, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not cruelty exactly, something closer to calculation. "We should reach the boundary stones before the sun rises fully." "And what happens then? You just leave me there?" Edwin's mouth curved into something that was not quite a smile. "Then the choice is no longer ours, child. It belongs to the mountain." Elena wanted to ask what that meant, but something in his tone told her he would give her no more answers than he already had. She fell silent, watching the trees thin ahead of them, revealing a steep slope rising into darkness, jagged rock breaking through the tree line like broken teeth. As they climbed higher, Elena noticed something strange. The guards who had marched so confidently through the lower forest began to slow, their eyes darting toward the shadows between the trees, their hands tightening on the hilts of the knives at their belts. Even Edwin, who had spoken with such cold certainty in the village square, grew quieter with every step, his sharp eyes now scanning the darkness instead of watching Elena. They were afraid. All of them. Whatever waited at the top of this mountain, they believed in it completely, even if they were the ones who had built the fear with their own stories over the years. That realization did something strange to Elena's own fear. If they were this frightened simply walking toward the mountain, what did that mean for whatever waited for her once they left her there alone? They stopped, finally, at a wide clearing, marked by tall stones arranged in a rough circle, each one carved with symbols worn smooth by centuries of wind and rain. In the center of the clearing stood a flat stone altar, waist-high, stained dark in patches that Elena did not let herself think too closely about. "This is the boundary," Edwin announced, though his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "Beyond this point, we do not go." Garrick and Dorian pulled Elena toward the altar. She tried to plant her feet, tried to pull back, but there were 4 of them and 1 of her, and within moments they had chained her wrists to iron rings set into the stone, the metal cold and unforgiving against her raw skin. "Please," she said, and hated how small her voice sounded now, how quickly her anger had drained away into something closer to desperation. "Please, don't do this. There has to be another way." Her mother's face flashed in her mind, the way she had looked away in the square. Her father's silence, the whole village, watching, letting this happen. No one was coming to save her. No one was going to change their minds. Edwin stepped close, his sharp face lit by the last of the torchlight the guards carried. "I am sorry it is you, Elena, truly. But the mountain must be fed, or the whole pack pays a price far worse than 1 life. You should be proud. You are protecting everyone you have ever known." "That's not comfort," she said through gritted teeth. "That's just an excuse." He didn't answer that. He simply turned, gathering the guards with a gesture, and the group began retreating back down the mountain path, torches bobbing and shrinking, until they disappeared entirely into the trees, leaving her alone in the dark, with only the wind and the distant call of some night bird to keep her company. Elena pulled against the chains until her wrists bled, until her arms shook with exhaustion, but the iron did not give. Eventually, she stopped fighting and simply sat, chained to the stone, staring up at a sky just beginning to lighten at its edges, and waited for whatever was coming for her. The hours crawled by. The sun rose fully and then began its slow arc across the sky, and still nothing came. Elena's fear settled into something duller, a low, constant hum beneath her exhaustion. She dozed once or twice to spite herself, jerking awake each time at some imagined sound, only to find the clearing empty and silent. It was near dusk, when the shadows had grown long and the air had turned cold again, that she heard it. A low sound, barely more than a breath moving through the trees, but deliberate, patient, circling. "Hello?" She called out, hating how her voice shook. "Who's there?" Nothing answered, but the sound continued, moving slowly around the edge of the clearing, and Elena felt every hair on her arms rise. Whatever it was watching her. Waiting. She thought of every story she had ever heard about the cursed wolf, all the details she had dismissed as exaggeration meant to frighten children. She thought about the way the guards' hands had trembled around their knives. She thought about Edwin's strange, careful phrase, "The mountain must be fed." The last light faded from the sky, and true darkness settled over the clearing, and Elena realized, with a jolt of cold certainty, that whatever she had been brought here to meet was no longer circling. It had stopped, somewhere just beyond the edge of the torchlight's memory, close enough that she could feel eyes on her skin, even though she could see nothing at all. "I know you're there," she whispered into the dark, forcing steel into her voice, even as her heart pounded against her ribs. "Whatever you are, show yourself." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, from the darkness between the trees, 2 eyes opened, catching what little light remained, and throwing it back gold, low to the ground, and utterly still. Elena's breath caught in her throat. She had been left here for exactly this moment, chained and helpless, and now the thing the entire village feared was finally looking back at her, and she had no idea whether she would survive to see the sunrise again. The eyes did not blink. They held steady in the darkness, low and gold, and Elena realized after a moment that they were not moving closer. Whatever watched her from the trees seemed content, for now, simply to watch. "If you're going to do something," she said, forcing the words out steady, even though her pulse hammered in her throat, "then do it. Don't just stare at me." A low sound answered her, not quite a growl, closer to something that might have been amusement, if it had come from a human throat, instead of an animal's. Then, slowly, a shape began to separate itself from the shadows between the trees. It was not what she expected. She had braced herself for something monstrous, some twisted, oversized creature built from every nightmare the village elders had ever described. Instead, a wolf stepped into the clearing. And though it was larger than any wolf she had ever seen or heard of, larger even than the great elk that sometimes wandered down from the higher slopes in winter, it moved with a kind of controlled grace that seemed almost deliberate, almost thoughtful. Its fur was black as the space between stars, and even in the dim light, Elena could see faint markings along its shoulders, pale silver lines that did not look natural, that looked instead like scars, or perhaps like something closer to old brands. It stopped several feet from the altar, close enough that she could see the muscles shifting beneath its fur, and studied her with those unnervingly steady eyes. Elena's instinct told her to scream, to thrash against her chains, to do anything but sit still and wait. But something in the wolf's gaze kept her frozen, not entirely out of fear, but out of a strange, creeping recognition that this creature was not simply hunting her. It was examining her, the way a person might examine an object they were trying to place, something familiar, seen from an unfamiliar angle. "You're not going to eat me right away, are you?" Elena said, more statement than question, though her voice still trembled slightly at the edges. "You're just going to look at me until I lose my mind from waiting." The wolf tilted its head, an oddly human gesture on such an inhuman creature, and something like a low huff of breath escaped it, almost a laugh. Minutes passed. The wolf circled the altar once, slow and unhurried, its paws silent against the stone ground, and Elena turned her head to track its movement, refusing to let it out of her sight, even as every instinct screamed at her to close her eyes and wait for whatever came next. When it had completed its circle, it stopped directly in front of her again, and this time, it lowered itself onto its haunches, settling in a way that suggested it intended to stay a while. "My name is Elena," she said, because the silence had become unbearable, and because talking, even to a wolf that might tear her apart at any moment, felt better than waiting in silence for her fate to be decided. "Elena Voss. I don't suppose that means anything to you." The wolf went very still. It was such a sudden, complete stillness that Elena felt a fresh wave of fear roll through her, sharper than before. She had said something wrong. Somehow, impossibly, her name had struck a chord in a creature that should not have understood human speech at all. "Voss," she repeated carefully, watching the wolf's reaction. "Is that familiar to you?" The wolf's lips pulled back slightly, not quite a snarl, more a grimace, and a low sound rumbled from deep in its chest, something between a growl and a groan, as if the name itself caused it pain. Then, before Elena could process what was happening, the wolf's shape began to change. It happened slowly at first, bones shifting beneath fur with a sound like wet cloth twisting, and then faster, the black fur receding, the wolf's frame folding and stretching, and reshaping itself with horrible, fluid speed. Elena wanted to look away, wanted to close her eyes against the sight of it, but she found she could not, some part of her too stunned, too transfixed, to break the connection. When the change finished, a man knelt in the wolf's place. He was tall, taller than any man Elena had ever seen in her village, with dark hair that fell past broad shoulders, and skin marked with the same faint silver scars that had traced the wolf's fur, now visible along his forearms and the side of his neck. He wore no shirt, only rough trousers that looked as though they had survived more seasons than they should have. And even kneeling in the dim light, there was something unmistakably commanding in the way he held himself. Not the posture of a beggar or a beast. The posture of someone who had once expected the world to bow to him, and had not entirely forgotten how that felt. His eyes, when he lifted them to meet hers, were the same gold they had been as a wolf, and they were fixed on her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Say your name again," he said. His voice was low, rough from disuse, but carried an unmistakable weight of authority beneath the roughness. "Elena," she said carefully, "Elena Voss." Something moved behind his eyes, something dark and old and furious, though it did not seem, this time, to be directed at her. "Voss," he repeated, and the name came out of him like a curse. Of course they would send a Voss. "You know my family?" He rose to his feet slowly, and even without the wolf's massive frame, he seemed to fill the clearing, his presence pressing against the air itself. "I knew your family very well, once, before your pack decided I was better left to die on this mountain than remembered as anything other than a monster." Elena's mind raced, trying to fit this new information into everything she had been told, Everything the elders and Garrick and the whispered stories had ever suggested. The cursed wolf, she said slowly. That's you. But you're not. You're a man. You can speak. You're not some mindless creature the pack has to keep feeding. No, he agreed, and there was something bitter in the single word. I am not mindless. I am not a monster. Whatever your elders have told frightened children for generations, to keep them from wandering too far up this mountain. I am something far more inconvenient to your pack than a monster. What do you mean? He studied her for a long moment before answering, as if weighing how much truth she could handle, or perhaps how much truth he was willing to give a stranger chained to an altar meant for his own consumption. I was the Alpha King of this territory, he said finally, long before your pack's elders were born, long before this village existed in its current form. I ruled these lands, and I ruled them fairly, as far as any king can claim fairness. And then, one night, the pack that called itself loyal to me decided my rule was no longer convenient to their ambitions. Elena's chains rattled softly as she shifted, trying to process what she was hearing. They betrayed you. They cursed me, he corrected, and his voice hardened. Bound me to this mountain, trapped between forms, unable to fully return to my human self except in brief moments like this one, unable to leave these boundaries without the curse tearing me apart from the inside. And then, to ensure their crime was never discovered, never questioned by future generations, they built a story around it. The cursed wolf, a monster to be feared, appeased, fed, his gaze sharpened on her, fed, apparently, with the daughters of the very family whose ancestor helped orchestrate my downfall in the first place. Elena felt something cold settle in her stomach. My family did this to you? Your ancestors, he said. Generations ago. I do not know how much of that history survived to reach you, if any of it did. I suspect your elders prefer their descendants ignorant of the details. They told us nothing, Elena said quietly. Just that there was a debt, that the mountain had to be fed, or the whole pack would suffer for it. He let out a short, humorless laugh. How convenient. A debt with no explanation is much easier to enforce than a debt people might question. Elena stared at him, at this man who only minutes ago had been a massive black wolf circling her with unreadable golden eyes, and felt the fear that had gripped her since she'd been dragged from her bed begin to shift into something else entirely. Not trust, not yet, but curiosity, sharp and insistent, cutting through the terror. If you're not a monster, she said slowly, then what happens to me now? Why send me here at all, if not to be eaten? His expression turned unreadable again, something guarded settling over his features like a mask. That, he said, is an excellent question, one I intend to think carefully about before I decide the answer. You're not going to kill me. I have never killed the ones your pack sends me, he said, and something in his tone made it clear. This was not the first time he had stood in this clearing, facing a chained and frightened stranger. Whatever stories they tell to justify sending someone to their death, the truth is simpler and far less dramatic. I let them go. I have let every single one of them go, back down the mountain, back to a pack that will look at them with suspicion for the rest of their lives because they dared to survive an encounter with the cursed wolf. Elena's mind spun. Then why does the pack keep sending people at all, if there's no danger? Because, he said, kneeling in front of the altar now, close enough that she could see the exhaustion carved into the lines of his face. Centuries of exhaustion pressed into features that otherwise looked no older than 30. Your elders do not want the sacrifices to survive to tell that story. They want fear. Fear keeps a pack obedient. Fear keeps questions from being asked about a curse your ancestors set in motion and have profited from ever since. Profited how? He reached out, and for a moment, Elena flinched, expecting violence, expecting the sharp bite of claws or teeth, despite everything he had just told her. Instead, his fingers found the chain binding her wrist, and with a strength that seemed almost gentle in its precision, he snapped the iron link as though it were nothing more than dry twig. That, he said, straightening back to his full height, is a longer story than we have time for tonight. For now, you have a choice to make, Elena Voss. I can take you back down this mountain, return you to a pack that will never fully trust you again, that may very well decide to send you back up here a second time the moment it suits their purposes. Or, you can stay. Stay here? With you? As my prisoner, if you like the sound of that better, he said, something almost wry touching the corner of his mouth, despite the weight of everything he had just revealed. Though I suspect, given what I have learned about your bloodline tonight, that you may be more valuable to me than any prisoner I have taken in a very long time. Elena rubbed at her freed wrist, feeling the raw skin beneath her fingers, and looked up at this man who called himself a king, who wore centuries of betrayal etched into silver scars along his skin, and who had just offered her a choice no one in her entire life had ever thought to give her. Tell me your name, she said. If I'm going to decide anything, I want to know who I'm deciding it with. Something shifted in his expression, surprise perhaps, or something close to respect. Kale, he said. I am called Kale. Elena looked past him, down the dark slope of the mountain, toward the distant lights of the village that had chained her here and abandoned her without a backward glance, and then back at the man who had just broken those chains with his bare hands. Then I choose to stay, Kale, she said, at least until I understand exactly what my family did to you, and why they were so desperate to keep it buried. Kale did not answer right away. He studied her instead, as if her decision to stay had surprised him more than anything else that had happened that night, and for a long moment the only sound in the clearing was the wind moving through the tall stones surrounding the altar. You should understand what you are agreeing to, he said finally. This mountain is not kind to those who do not belong to it. The curse that binds me does not simply keep me trapped within these boundaries. It reaches into everything around me. The land itself remembers what was done here. I'm not asking for comfort, Elena said, sliding down from the altar now that her wrists were free, testing her legs after so many hours chained in place. I'm asking for the truth. You said my ancestors were involved in whatever happened to you. I want to know how, and I want to know why. Kale turned and began walking toward the tree line, and after a moment's hesitation, Elena followed, matching her pace to his longer stride. The forest beyond the clearing was different from the one she had walked through with the guards, older somehow, the trees more twisted, the undergrowth thicker and stranger, as if the mountain existed slightly apart from the rest of the world. 200 years ago, give or take a handful of seasons, I stopped counting somewhere along the way, Kale began. This territory was ruled by my family, not through fear, though I know that is likely all the stories your pack tells now describe. We ruled through strength, yes, because strength is how any pack survives, but also through fairness. Disputes were settled honestly. Resources were shared according to need, not simply according to rank. My father built that system, and I inherited it, and I did my best to honor it. That doesn't sound like something that would lead to a curse, Elena said. It did not. Not directly, Kale agreed. What led to the curse was greed, and the particular ambitions of a small group within my own court who believed fairness was a weakness to be exploited, rather than a strength to be protected. Among them was a young man named Aldrich Voss. Elena's steps faltered. Voss. Your family's founder, as far as I have ever been able to determine, Kale said, glancing back at her. Aldrich was clever, ambitious, and deeply unhappy, with a system that did not favor him, simply because he wished to be favored. He convinced several others in my court that my rule was holding the pack back from greater power, greater territory, greater wealth. He was not entirely wrong that such things were possible. He was entirely wrong about the cost such ambitions would carry. They emerged from the trees into a wide open space, where the ruins of what had once clearly been a grand structure rose against the night sky. Broken stone walls stood in jagged formation, moss and ivy claiming what the centuries had not already crumbled, and at the center of it all stood the remains of a great hall, roofless now, open to the stars. This was my home, Kale said quietly, and something in his voice had changed, grown heavier. Before Aldrich and his allies found a witch willing to bind me here, in exchange for promises they never intended to keep. Elena stared up at the broken walls, trying to imagine them whole, trying to imagine this devastated place as a living, breathing court full of people. What happened that night? Kale led her through what had once been an entrance, stepping over fallen stone with the ease of someone who had walked this path 1,000 times before. They waited until a gathering, when most of the pack was assembled within these walls, celebrating the turning of the season. Aldrich had spent months building alliances, promising power and position to anyone who would support him. When the moment came, He and his conspirators moved together, cornering me at the height of the celebration, when I was least prepared to defend myself against betrayal from within my own ranks. They attacked you, in front of everyone? Not attacked precisely, Kale said, and there was old bitterness threaded through the words. The witch they had brought in secret worked her binding before I understood what was happening. One moment I stood among my people, and the next, I felt something take hold of me from the inside, something that twisted my very nature and locked it in place. By the time I understood what Aldrich had done, I could no longer fully control my own transformation. The curse trapped me between man and wolf, unable to leave this mountain, unable to fully return to either form without immense effort and constant pain. Elena thought of the way he had knelt before her at the altar, the visible effort it had seemed to take simply to hold his human shape long enough to speak with her. That's what I saw tonight, you forcing yourself to stay human. Yes, Kale said simply. It grows harder with each passing year, if you can believe that. 2 centuries of fighting my own body for even brief moments of clarity. But why keep sending people to you at all, if the pack knew you weren't dangerous? Elena asked. If Aldrich orchestrated all of this just for power, why would his descendants keep feeding the story instead of simply leaving you alone? Kale's jaw tightened. Because leaving me alone risked something Aldrich's line has spent 2 centuries protecting. As long as the pack believes a monster must be appeased on this mountain, no one questions why the Voss family holds such influence within the Elder Council. No one questions the histories they have carefully rewritten to erase their ancestors' betrayal. The fear serves them, Elena. It always has. The weight of that settled heavily over her. She thought of the elders in the square, of Edwin's careful, practiced explanation about debts that had to be paid, of her own mother looking away rather than fighting for her daughter's life. All of it, built on a lie 2 centuries old, maintained by a family that had never told its own children the truth of where their power had actually come from. I didn't know any of this, she said quietly. None of us did. We just grew up being told to fear the mountain, to be grateful it wasn't us chosen when someone else's name was called. I do not blame you for the sins of an ancestor you never met, Kale said, and something in his tone softened slightly as he said it. But I would be lying if I said your name did not strike something in me tonight. 2 centuries of watching Voss elders send strangers up this mountain to maintain their power, and now, finally, a Voss stands before me directly. What does that mean for me? Elena asked, unable to keep a thread of unease from her voice. Kale turned to face her fully, his golden eyes catching what little moonlight filtered through the broken roof above them. It means, Elena Voss, that you may be the first opportunity I have had in 200 years to finally understand exactly how this curse was built, and perhaps, if the old stories about bloodline magic hold any truth, how it might finally be unraveled. Elena felt a chill move through her that had nothing to do with the cold mountain air. You think I can help break the curse? I think, Kale said carefully, that fate rarely sends a descendant of the one who cursed a king directly into that same king's territory without reason. Whether that reason works in my favor or simply deepens my torment remains to be seen. But I intend to find out, and I would very much like your help in doing so. Elena looked around at the ruins surrounding them, at the broken remnants of a kingdom stolen through betrayal, and thought of the empty, guilty faces of everyone who had watched her be marched up this mountain without a single word of protest. Whatever loyalty she might once have felt toward her pack had been chained to that altar and left behind with the rest of her old life. Then show me everything, she said. Every piece of this story. I want to understand exactly what my family did, and I want to help you take back what they stole. Something in Kale's expression shifted then, something that might have been the first flicker of hope he had allowed himself in longer than he could probably remember. Careful with promises like that, he said quietly. This mountain has a way of testing whether people mean what they say. I mean it, Elena said, and found, to her own surprise, that she did. Above them, clouds shifted, and moonlight spilled fully into the ruined hall for the first time that night, illuminating carved symbols along the remaining walls. Symbols that matched the ones Elena had seen, etched into the boundary stones far below. Kale's gaze moved over them with an old, tired familiarity, and Elena understood, watching him, that whatever they were about to uncover together, it would not be simple, and it would not be safe. But for the first time since she had been dragged from her bed in the dark hours before dawn, Elena felt something other than fear settle over her. She felt purpose, and after a lifetime of being the least favored, the least protected, the easiest to sacrifice, that feeling was worth more to her than she could have imagined only a day before. Morning came slowly over the mountain, gray light seeping through the broken roof of the ruined hall long before the sun itself cleared the eastern ridge. Elena had slept in fits and starts, curled against a fallen pillar, with Cale's discarded cloak draped over her shoulders, and when she finally opened her eyes fully, she found she was not alone. An old man sat a short distance away, tending a small fire in a ring of stones that looked recently used, far more recently than the ruins around it would suggest. He was thin, silver-haired, with a face lined by decades that seemed to sit strangely, against eyes that were sharp and alert, missing nothing. "You're awake," he said, not looking up from the fire. "Good. Cale said you might sleep through the whole morning after a night like the one you had." Elena sat up quickly, pulling the cloak tighter around herself. "Who are you?" "Silas," the old man said, finally glancing over at her with something like amusement in his expression. "I have served this family since before the curse took hold. Someone has to keep the king fed and this ruin from collapsing entirely around him, even if half the work these days is convincing him to eat at all." "You've been here the whole time? 200 years? Silas chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "Not quite 200 years, no. The curse binds Cale to this mountain, not me. I could leave whenever I wished. I simply choose not to." He turned a piece of meat over the fire with practiced ease. "Someone loyal ought to remain, don't you think, after everyone else abandoned him?" Elena studied the old man more closely, noting the careful way he moved, despite his apparent age, the alertness in his gaze that suggested he had survived more than simple years alone. "Are you like him? A wolf?" "Once," Silas said simply. "Age has slowed the change in me, the way it slows everything else eventually. But yes, I served in Cale's guard long before Aldrich Voss's betrayal, and I have remained ever since, tending to what little of this place still stands." The mention of her family's name, spoken so casually, sent an uncomfortable jolt through Elena. "You knew what my ancestor did, all this time." "I watched it happen," Silas said, and for the first time, something harder crept into his voice. "I watched Aldrich smile at his king, while conspirators moved into position around the hall. I watched the witch's binding take hold, and Cale fall to his knees, unable to understand what was happening to his own body. I have carried that memory for 2 centuries, girl, so forgive me if I do not extend much warmth toward the name Voss, regardless of how young and blameless you may be." Elena felt the sting of that but did not argue against it. "I understand," she said quietly. "I would probably feel the same, in your position." Something in her answer seemed to soften Silas slightly, the tension easing from his shoulders. "Cale tells me you intend to help him understand the curse, to help unravel what your ancestor built." "If I can, yes." "Then you will need more than good intentions," Silas said, gesturing toward the far end of the ruined hall, where a section of wall still stood mostly intact, a heavy wooden door set into it, that looked far newer than the stones surrounding it. "There is a library through there. What remains of one, at least. Records from before the curse, and some gathered since, in the years I have spent trying to understand what was done to him. It has not been enough to break the binding. Perhaps a Voss bloodline standing in these halls again will change that." Cale emerged from the tree line, as Silas spoke, moving in his human form this time, though Elena could see the visible strain in the careful, controlled way he walked, as though holding this shape required constant effort beneath the surface. He looked exhausted, in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. "You should not push yourself so hard," Silas said, worry creeping into his voice as he studied Cale's face. "You held the shape too long last night." "I needed to speak with her clearly," Cale said, lowering himself onto a fallen block of stone near the fire. "Whatever the cost." Elena watched the exchange between them, the easy familiarity of 2 people who had relied on each other through unimaginable stretches of time, and felt a strange pang of something she could not quite name. Loneliness, perhaps, recognizing itself in the deep bond between these 2 survivors. "Silas mentioned a library," she said, partly to change the subject, and partly because the idea had already taken root in her mind. a place to start making sense of everything she had learned. Records about the curse. What remains of one, Cale said. Much of what my family once kept was destroyed the night of the betrayal, either by design or by the chaos that followed. What Silas has managed to preserve and gather since is fragmented, incomplete, but it may hold pieces we have not yet been able to fit together. Then let's start there, Elena said, rising to her feet, feeling more purposeful than exhausted, despite the rough night behind her. If I'm going to understand what my family did and how to undo it, I want to see everything you have. Cale's gaze lingered on her for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his golden eyes. You are certain about this. Once you begin pulling at these threads, Elena, there will be no comfortable way to stop. The truth of what your ancestor did runs deeper and uglier than what I told you last night. I'm not looking for comfortable, Elena said. I spent my whole life being told comfortable lies by people who were supposed to protect me, and look where that got me. Chained to an altar and left for dead by people who called themselves my family. Something like respect flickered across Cale's face at that. Very well, he said, rising carefully from the stone. Then let us begin. The library, when Elena finally stepped inside, was smaller than she had expected but denser. Shelves built from salvaged wood, packed tightly with scrolls, bound books, and loose sheets of parchment covered in handwriting that ranged from elegant and formal to hurried and barely legible. Dust hung thick in the air, disturbed only by their entrance, and Elena felt a strange reverence settle over her as she took it all in. Where do we even begin with all of this? She asked. With what I already know, Cale said, moving toward a shelf near the back and retrieving a thick, leather-bound volume with careful hands. This was my father's record of pack law and lineage. It predates Aldrich's betrayal by several generations, but it contains something important. A record of bloodline magic within certain founding families, including, as it happens, the Voss line. Elena's stomach tightened. Bloodline magic. What does that mean? Certain families, in the earliest days of this territory, carried particular gifts, passed through blood rather than through training, Cale explained, setting the book down on a wide table and carefully opening its brittle pages. The Voss family's gift, according to this record, was tied to binding and unbinding, to curses, and to the breaking of them. Elena stared down at the faded, careful handwriting, at a family tree she did not recognize but somehow knew, with a sinking certainty, connected directly back to her own. You're saying my family didn't just betray you. They had a specific gift that made them uniquely capable of building a curse strong enough to hold an Alpha King in place for 200 years. Yes, Cale said quietly, and if the old records hold true, that same bloodline gift may be the only thing capable of unbinding what was done. Which means, Elena Voss, that you may carry within you the exact power needed to finally set me free. The weight of that realization settled over the small library like a held breath, and Elena looked down at her own hands, trying to imagine what kind of power might be sleeping quietly beneath her skin, waiting to be discovered. Then we had better find out, she said, exactly what I'm capable of. Days passed differently on the mountain than they had in the village below. Without the rhythm of chores and gatherings and familiar faces to mark the hours, Elena found herself measuring time instead, by the slow progress she and Cale made through the ruined library, by the careful, patient way Silas taught her small fragments of what he remembered about bloodline magic, and by the strange, growing sense that this broken, half-forgotten place was beginning to feel less like a prison and more like somewhere she belonged. Try again, Silas said, standing a few paces back in the clearing outside the ruined hall, watching as Elena held her hands over a length of chain he had produced from somewhere in his collection of salvaged relics. Focus on what the book described, not force, intention. Elena closed her eyes, trying to quiet the frustration building in her chest. She had spent the better part of the morning attempting to coax even the faintest response from whatever gift supposedly ran through her blood, and so far, nothing had happened beyond a persistent headache and a growing doubt that any of this was real. Maybe the records are wrong, she said, opening her eyes and letting her hands fall to her sides. Maybe whatever gift my family had faded out generations ago. I don't feel anything, Silas. No power, no pull, nothing. 2 centuries is a long time for a gift to lie dormant, Silas admitted, though his tone remained patient, unbothered by her frustration. It is possible your line has grown thin, diluted through generations who never needed to call on it, but possible is not certain. Cale did not simply guess when he decided you might be capable of this. Then what makes him so sure? A voice answered from behind her, low and even. Because I have felt something in your presence since the moment you spoke your name in that clearing. Cale stepped out from the tree line, watching her with the same careful, assessing look he so often wore, though something warmer had crept into it over the past several days, something Elena was only beginning to let herself notice. Whatever lies dormant in you responded to me, even if you did not recognize it yourself. The curse shifted, however slightly, the night you arrived. Shifted how? The pain eases when you are near, Cale admitted, and something in the confession seemed to cost him, as though he did not enjoy revealing even small vulnerabilities. Not gone, not broken, but eased, in a way it has not been in longer than I can properly remember. Elena felt a strange warmth spread through her chest at that admission, quickly followed by uncertainty about what exactly that warmth meant. Then maybe we're going about this the wrong way, she said, turning back to Silas. Maybe it's not about forcing some hidden power to appear on command. Maybe it responds to something else. Such as? Silas asked. Elena looked toward Cale. Him. Maybe it responds to him specifically, not to random objects like a length of old chain. Cale's expression shifted, something cautious entering his gaze. You want to test that theory directly on the curse itself. Why not? If being near me eases the pain even slightly, maybe touching the source of it directly would tell us more than another hour spent staring at chains that mean nothing to either of us. Silas made a low, uneasy sound. That is not without risk, Elena. If the gift responds unpredictably, or not at all, the curse could react badly. It has lashed out before, at those who tried to interfere carelessly. I'm not being careless, Elena said. I'm being deliberate. There's a difference. Cale studied her for a long moment, weighing something behind his golden eyes, and then, slowly, he nodded. Very well. But we do this with caution. If I tell you to stop, you stop immediately, regardless of what you believe you are close to discovering. Agreed. They moved to the center of the ruined hall, where morning light spilled through the broken roof in long, pale beams, and Cale lowered himself to sit facing her, his expression carefully composed, despite the tension Elena could see coiled beneath the surface of his stillness. The curse sits closest to the surface here, he said, drawing his sleeve back to reveal one of the silver-scarred patterns along his forearm, the marks that Elena had first noticed, etched into his wolf form's fur days ago. Silas believes these marks are the physical trace of the binding itself, the place where the magic anchors most directly into my body. Elena knelt in front of him, her heart beating quickly despite her outward calm. May I? Carefully, Cale said, and there was something almost gentle in the way he said it, an unspoken trust extended despite everything that stood between their two bloodlines. She reached out and pressed her fingers lightly against the silver scar along his forearm. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. A jolt of energy shot up through Elena's fingers, sharp and cold, like plunging her hand into icy water, and she gasped, though she did not pull away. Images flooded through her mind, fractured and disjointed. Flashes of a great hall filled with celebration, a young man's smiling, treacherous face, a witch's chanting voice, and Cale, younger, unguarded, collapsing to his knees as something dark and suffocating wound itself around him from the inside. Elena, Cale's voice cut through the visions, tight with concern. Elena, can you hear me? She blinked, and the images scattered like startled birds, leaving her breathless and shaking, still kneeling, with her fingers pressed against his scarred skin. I saw it, she said, her voice unsteady. I saw the night it happened, the witch, my ancestor, all of it. You saw the binding itself, Silas said, his voice hushed with something between awe and alarm. That should not have been possible without triggering the curse's full defensive response. Maybe it recognized her, Cale said slowly, his gaze fixed on Elena with an intensity that made her pulse quicken for reasons that had nothing to do with fear. Maybe it recognized the blood that built it, and instead of resisting, it allowed her a glimpse. Elena withdrew her hand slowly, flexing her fingers, testing the strange, lingering tingle still present beneath her skin. "There's something else," she said. "In the vision, the witch said something, right at the end, right before the binding took hold completely. A phrase, like she was setting a condition into the curse itself." "What phrase?" Cale asked, leaning forward. Elena closed her eyes, trying to hold on to the fading edges of the vision before it slipped away entirely. "She said the binding would hold until blood freely given returned what blood taken had stolen. I don't fully understand what that means, but it felt important, deliberate." Silence fell over the ruined hall as all three of them turned the words over, searching for meaning. "Blood freely given," Silas said slowly, "as opposed to blood taken by force. That would explain why simply sending sacrifices to this mountain never broke the curse, no matter how many were offered over the years. They were taken, forced, unwilling, never freely given." "Then what would count?" Elena asked. "What would satisfy that condition?" Cale's gaze had not left her face since she'd finished describing the vision, and something in his expression made Elena's breath catch. "A willing act," he said quietly. "Freely chosen, by someone of the bloodline that built the curse, given not out of obligation or fear, but out of genuine choice. Like me choosing to stay, instead of being forced here." "Perhaps," Cale said, "though I suspect the witch's condition demanded something more specific than simply remaining on this mountain. Blood," she said, "not presence, not company." Elena's mind raced through the possibilities, uneasy at where this line of thought seemed to be leading. "You think the curse needs an actual sacrifice, my blood, given willingly, to undo what was done?" "I do not know," Cale admitted. "The vision was fragmented, incomplete. We may be missing crucial context that changes the meaning entirely, but if that interpretation holds true, it would explain why 2 centuries of forced sacrifices accomplished nothing, and it would explain why the curse allowed you, specifically, to witness that moment at all." Silas moved to stand beside them, his expression grave. "This is dangerous ground, Elena. If the witch's condition truly requires a blood sacrifice from you, willingly given, we need to understand exactly what that would cost before either of you decides to pursue it further." "I understand the risk," Elena said, though a part of her, quiet and stubborn, was already turning the idea over, weighing what she might be willing to give, in order to undo the damage her own bloodline had caused. "But we came here to understand this curse, and I'm not interested in stopping, now that we've finally found a real thread to follow." Cale's expression remained troubled, though something in his eyes suggested he was fighting against his own instinct to protect her from whatever came next. "We will proceed carefully," he said finally, slowly. "I will not risk your safety chasing a fragment of a vision without understanding it fully first." "And in the meantime?" Elena asked. "In the meantime," Cale said, rising to his feet and offering her a hand to help her up from the stone floor, "we continue searching these records for anything that might clarify exactly what the witch intended. And you continue discovering exactly what this gift of yours is capable of, carefully, and with both Silas and myself close at hand." Elena took his offered hand, and as her fingers closed around his, she felt that same strange warmth she had noticed earlier flare briefly between them, gentler this time, less like a jolt and more like recognition settling quietly into place. Whatever the coming days held, whatever the curse ultimately demanded of her, Elena understood, standing in the ruined hall with the broken remnants of a stolen kingdom around her, that she was no longer simply trying to survive an encounter with a monster from old village stories. She was becoming part of something far larger than herself, tangled irreversibly with a king whose fate had been stolen by her own bloodline, and with every passing day on this mountain, the thought of ever returning to the pack that had abandoned her felt less like a loss, and more like an escape she had never known she needed. A week into her stay on the mountain, Elena found herself falling into an unexpected rhythm. Mornings were spent with Silas, sorting through crumbling records and testing small, careful uses of whatever gift lived in her blood, learning slowly how to sense the faint traces of old magic left behind in objects and places throughout the ruins. Afternoons belonged to the library, where she and Cale pored over pages together, piecing apart the fragmented history of his betrayal, one brittle document at a time. Evenings were quieter, spent around Silas's fire, where conversation had begun to drift, unexpectedly, toward things that had nothing to do with curses or bloodlines at all. It was during one such afternoon, deep in the library, that Elena found the record that changed everything. "Cale," she said, her voice sharp enough to pull him instantly from the scroll he had been examining. "You need to see this." He crossed the room quickly, leaning over her shoulder to look at the document she had spread across the table, an old ledger listing names and titles in careful, formal handwriting. "This is a record of the conspirators," Elena said, tracing her finger down the list. "Not just Aldrich. Look at the names." Cale went very still as his eyes moved down the page. "Corwin," he read aloud, his voice tight. "Edwin, these are the names of your current elders." "Their ancestors," Elena said. "Look at the dates. These aren't the same men, obviously, but the family names match exactly. Aldrich didn't act alone. He built an entire circle of allies who helped orchestrate the betrayal, and every single one of those families still holds a seat on your pack's council today." The implications settled heavily over both of them. 200 years, Cale said slowly, and the same families have maintained power this entire time, built on a lie they have every reason to keep buried. "There's more," Elena said, turning to a second document tucked within the same collection, this one written in a different, more hurried hand, as though recorded in haste rather than with careful, formal intention. "This looks like a private account, not an official record. Someone who witnessed what happened and didn't agree with it." She read aloud, her voice growing unsteady as the words revealed themselves. "I write this in secret, for I fear what will happen should Aldrich or his allies discover I have kept any record at all. Tonight, they took from our king not only his freedom, but his court's memory of the truth. Aldrich has already begun reshaping the story told to the young ones, painting Cale as a danger the pack was fortunate to escape, rather than a leader stolen from them through treachery. I fear, in time, no one will remember what truly happened here at all." Elena looked up at Cale, her chest tight. "Someone tried to preserve the truth. Someone in your own court saw what was happening, and understood exactly what Aldrich was building." "Whoever they were," Cale said quietly, "their warning did not survive long enough to change anything. The story Aldrich built has held for 2 centuries. Until now," Elena said. Silas appeared in the doorway then, his expression drawn tight with something between excitement and worry. "I heard voices raised. What have you found?" Elena explained quickly, watching the old man's face shift through disbelief, anger, and finally, a grim sort of vindication as the pieces settled into place. "I suspected something of this nature," Silas admitted, once she had finished. "The elders' families have held their seats far too consistently for 200 years to be simple coincidence. But suspecting is not the same as holding proof in hand." "What do we do with it?" Elena asked. "Even if we understand the truth now, that doesn't mean the pack will believe it, or that the elders will simply step aside once confronted." Cale's expression had turned hard and thoughtful, the weight of the discovery visibly settling into something more purposeful behind his eyes. "No," he agreed. "Men who have built 2 centuries of power on a lie do not surrender it easily, regardless of how much proof stands against them. If we move too quickly, too openly, they may simply destroy whatever remains of this evidence and tighten their control further, using fear of the mountain as justification. Then we need to be careful," Elena said. "But we can't just sit on this. My family has been at the center of decisions that hurt people for 200 years, and I want to understand exactly how deep that damage runs before we decide what to do about it." "There is a way to learn more," Silas said slowly, glancing toward Cale with something cautious in his expression. "The witch who cast the binding, if any trace of her remains, any record of where her line settled after the betrayal, she may hold knowledge neither Cale nor these old documents can provide." "You think she's still alive?" Elena asked. "Unlikely, after 2 centuries," Silas admitted. "But witches of her power often pass knowledge, and sometimes lingering influence, through their own bloodlines, much as your family passed its gift through yours. If descendants remain, they may know more about the exact terms of the curse than even Cale himself does." Cale's jaw tightened at the suggestion. "Finding them would mean leaving this mountain's boundaries, which I cannot do without the curse tearing through me. It would mean sending someone else out to search, someone I would be trusting with knowledge, dangerous enough to get them killed, if the wrong people learned what they were looking for. I could go, Elena said immediately. Absolutely not, Cale said, sharper than she had heard him speak in days. You are the one thread we have toward breaking this curse. I will not send you back down into a pack that already tried to feed you to a mountain once. I'm not asking your permission, Cale, Elena said, meeting his gaze steadily, despite the flare of frustration in his expression. I want to help. If there's information down there that could speed this along, I'm not going to sit up here safely while you and Silas do all the dangerous work. It is not about permission, Cale said, his voice lower now, something raw bleeding through the authority he usually carried so easily. It is about not wanting to lose the one person who has made these ruins feel less like a tomb in longer than I care to admit. The admission hung in the air between them, unexpected and honest, in a way that made Elena's breath catch. Silas, watching the exchange, quietly excused himself from the room, leaving the two of them alone amid the scattered records and centuries of buried history. Cale, Elena said softly, I'm not asking to be protected. I spent my entire life being the one nobody protected, the one everyone was willing to sacrifice the moment it became convenient. I don't want that from you either. I want to be someone who actually helps, who actually matters in this. You already matter, Cale said, and the words seemed to cost him something, an admission he had clearly not intended to make so plainly. More than you understand, Elena. And that is precisely why the thought of sending you back into danger, even for good reason, sits so poorly with me. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of everything unspoken between them, pressing into the quiet library air. Then we find another way, Elena said finally, softening. Together. If there's information we need from below, we find it carefully, without putting either of us directly in harm's way before we're ready. But we don't stop searching, Cale. Not now that we're this close to understanding the truth. Cale studied her for a long moment, something complicated moving behind his golden eyes, gratitude and worry, and something warmer besides, tangled together in a way he seemed unwilling or unable to fully name. Together, then, he agreed finally, but carefully. I have already lost 2 centuries to the schemes of your ancestors' allies. I will not lose you to carelessness now. Outside the ruined hall, evening was settling over the mountain, painting the broken stone walls in soft gold light, and Elena found herself, not for the first time in recent days, wondering how a place built from betrayal and centuries of loneliness had somehow come to feel more like home than the village she had grown up in ever had. The nights were the hardest for Cale, Elena learned, though he never said so directly. She noticed it instead in small things, the way his shoulders tightened as darkness fell, the way his breathing changed, growing more deliberate, more controlled, as though he were bracing himself against something only he could feel building beneath his skin. Does it get worse at night? She asked one evening, watching him from across the fire Silas had built near the entrance to the ruined hall. The old man had retired early, leaving the two of them alone with the crackling flames and the wide, star-scattered sky above the broken roof. Cale's gaze lifted to hers, and for a moment she thought he might deflect the question the way he so often did when it strayed too close to his own suffering. Instead, he simply nodded. The curse pulls hardest when the sun sets. It always has. Something about the binding was tied to nightfall specifically, though I have never fully understood why. Show me, Elena said, rising and crossing to sit beside him, instead of across the fire. Let me try to help, the way I did before with the vision. That was different, Cale said, though he did not pull away as she settled closer. That was a memory surfacing, not active pain. I do not know what would happen if you tried to reach into the curse itself while it is actively working against me. Then we'll find out carefully, Elena said, echoing words he had used with her only days before. Isn't that what you told me? We proceed carefully, together. Something like a reluctant smile touched the corner of his mouth. You remember my own words better than I do, apparently. I pay attention, Elena said simply. He held out his forearm, the silver scars catching the firelight, and Elena reached out to press her fingers against them, the way she had before, though this time, instead of images flooding through her, she felt something different entirely. A low, grinding pressure, like stone dragging against stone, deep beneath his skin, constant and exhausting in a way that made her breath catch just from feeling the edge of it. This is what you feel every night, she said softly, understanding dawning with painful clarity. All the time, not just sometimes. It becomes background, after enough centuries, Cale said, though the tightness in his jaw told a different story than his casual words. One learns to function despite it. That's not the same as it not hurting, Elena said, and she closed her eyes, focusing the way Silas had taught her, trying to reach past the surface pressure, toward whatever deeper current ran beneath it. She did not fully understand what she was doing, only that some instinct guided her fingers, her focus, toward easing rather than forcing, toward soothing rather than breaking. The grinding pressure beneath her fingers shifted, softened slightly, like a held breath finally allowed to release halfway. Cale inhaled sharply beside her. What did you just do? I don't know exactly, Elena admitted, opening her eyes to find him watching her with an expression she had not seen from him before, something unguarded and slightly stunned. It felt like the pain wanted somewhere to go, so I gave it somewhere. Did it help? More than you understand, Cale said quietly. That is the first time in longer than I can remember that the pressure has eased without me forcing my own will against it every single moment. Elena felt a warmth spread through her chest at that, pride mixed with something gentler, something that had been growing quietly between them over the past several days despite everything else demanding their attention. Then I'll keep doing it, she said, every night, if it helps. Elena, Cale said, and something in the way he said her name made her look up and meet his eyes fully. You do not owe me this. Whatever debt you feel toward correcting what your ancestor did, easing my suffering each night goes well beyond any obligation you should feel toward a stranger's centuries-old curse. You're not a stranger, Elena said quietly. Not anymore, and I'm not doing this because I feel like I owe you something. I'm doing it because I want to. The fire crackled between them, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of her words settling into the space between their shoulders, close enough now that Elena could feel the warmth radiating from him, could see the flicker of firelight catching in his golden eyes. When I was chained to that altar, she said softly, waiting for whatever was coming for me, I thought that was the worst night of my life, my own family standing by, while strangers dragged me up a mountain to die. But it turned out to be the night I met the first person who ever actually chose me, chose to protect me, chose to trust me with the truth, instead of feeding me convenient lies. Cale's expression shifted, something raw moving behind his careful composure. You give me too much credit. I offered you a choice because it suited my own purposes as much as any concern for your well-being. Maybe it started that way, Elena said, but it isn't just that anymore, is it? He was quiet for a long moment, studying her face in the firelight, with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. No, he admitted finally, his voice low and rough. It is not just that anymore. Elena felt her breath catch as he reached out, his fingers brushing gently against her cheek, careful, in a way that seemed almost at odds with the raw power she knew lived beneath his controlled exterior. I have not allowed myself to want anything beyond breaking this curse in longer than I can properly remember, he said quietly. It felt like a weakness I could not afford, not while trapped here, not while carrying the weight of everything Aldrich stole from me. But you make it difficult to remember why I ever believed that. Maybe wanting something isn't a weakness, Elena said softly, leaning slightly into his touch, despite the uncertainty still tangled through her chest. Maybe it's just something you were never allowed to have before now. Cale's gaze searched hers, and whatever hesitation had held him back seemed to finally give way. He leaned closer, slow and deliberate, giving her every opportunity to pull back if she wished. She did not. When his lips finally met hers, it was gentle, careful, as though he were afraid this fragile, unexpected thing between them might shatter if he moved too quickly. Elena kissed him back, and for a moment, the weight of curses and stolen kingdoms and 2 centuries of betrayal fell away entirely, leaving only the warmth of the fire and the quiet, startling comfort of finally being chosen by someone instead of discarded. When they finally broke apart, Cale rested his forehead lightly against hers, his breathing unsteady. This complicates things, he murmured. Does it? Elena asked, a small smile tugging at her lips, despite the seriousness of everything else weighing on them. It gives me something new to fear losing, Cale said quietly, and I do not know how to hold that fear alongside everything else this mountain has already taken from me. Then we hold it together, Elena said. The same way we've been doing everything else since I got here. Cale pulled back slightly, studying her with an expression that mixed tenderness with something more troubled, something that told Elena he was already thinking ahead to dangers she had not yet fully considered. Elena, if the pack learns you are not only alive, but that you have grown close to me, learns that you may hold the key to breaking a curse their elders have profited from maintaining for 2 centuries, they will not simply let that stand. Corwin and Edwin will see this as a direct threat to everything their families have built. The warmth in Elena's chest cooled slightly as the weight of his words settled in. You think they'll come after us? I think, Cale said carefully, that men who have protected a 200-year-old lie through fear and control will not hesitate to protect it further, by whatever means necessary, once they understand what is truly at stake. He glanced toward the dark tree line beyond the fire's light, something wary entering his expression. We should be careful how much time we spend near the boundary stones from now on. Word travels, even from places people believe are forgotten. Elena followed his gaze into the darkness, an uneasy feeling settling low in her stomach despite the lingering warmth of the moment they had just shared. Somewhere beyond those trees, her old life waited, unaware of everything that had changed since the night she had been chained to an altar and left for the mountain to claim. She did not yet know how right Cale's caution would prove to be, or how quickly the fragile peace they had built together on this broken mountain was about to be tested. It was a hunter named Ronan who first brought the news down from the higher slopes, breathless and pale, insisting he had seen firelight flickering near the old ruins, where no fire should have burned in 2 centuries. The elders dismissed him at first, certain the man had simply lost his bearings in unfamiliar terrain. But when a second hunter returns days later with the same report, along with a claim that he had glimpsed a figure moving among the trees who was unmistakably human rather than beast, Corwin could no longer afford to ignore what was being said. He called Edwin to his private chambers that evening, the 2 of them alone by lamplight, the weight of 2 centuries of carefully maintained control hanging heavily between them. If the girl survived, Corwin said slowly, pacing the length of the room, and if she has somehow found shelter with the creature, instead of meeting the end the mountain was meant to provide, we have a serious problem. You think the cursed wolf is protecting her, Edwin said, his sharp features drawn tight with concern. Why would it do such a thing, after 200 years of accepting what the pack sent it? I do not know, Corwin admitted, but I know that if word spreads through the pack that a sacrifice survived, that the mountain did not claim her the way it has claimed every offering before her, questions will follow. Questions about why the ritual has continued at all, if survival was ever truly possible. Edwin's expression darkened further. Questions about why our families have held such consistent influence on the council for so many generations. The unspoken fear settled heavily between them, old and familiar, carried quietly for 200 years by every generation of their families who had understood, even if never spoken aloud among themselves, exactly how fragile their inherited power truly was, should the truth ever surface. We cannot allow her to return, Corwin said finally, his voice hard with decision. Whatever has happened up there, whatever she may have learned, she cannot be permitted to bring it back down this mountain. You mean to send warriors after her, Edwin said slowly. I mean to protect this pack from chaos, Corwin corrected sharply. If the girl has aligned herself with the creature, if she poses any threat to the stability we have maintained, then yes, warriors will be sent, and the matter will be resolved quietly, the way such matters have always been resolved. Word of the elders' decision reached Garrick 2 days later, delivered as a direct order rather than a request for counsel. He stood in Corwin's chambers, jaw tight, listening to instructions that made his stomach turn. You want me to lead warriors up that mountain to eliminate her, he said flatly, once Corwin had finished speaking. The same girl I helped chain to that altar myself. I want you to protect this pack, Corwin said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Whatever sympathy you feel toward Elena Voss, remember that she may now be working alongside a creature this pack has feared and appeased for 2 centuries. If she has turned against us, willingly or not, she represents a danger we cannot afford to ignore. Garrick's hands curled into fists at his sides, old loyalty warring against a growing unease he had carried since the night he had watched Elena's own family look away while she was dragged from her bed. And if she hasn't turned against us, if she's simply trying to survive, Then she will have the opportunity to return peacefully, under guard, and explain herself before the council, Corwin said, though something in his tone suggested this outcome was far less likely than the alternative already being prepared for. But if she resists, or if the creature protects her by force, you have my full authority to do whatever is necessary to end the threat. Garrick left the chambers with the weight of that order settling like stone in his chest, gathering a small group of warriors he trusted, men he had fought beside for years, though none of them spoke much as they prepared for the climb ahead. He thought of Elena's voice in the dark forest, asking him why it had to be her, and he found he no longer had a good answer to give. High on the mountain, Elena felt the shift in the air before she fully understood its cause, a low unease settling over the ruins that she could not quite name. Something's changed, she said to Kale, standing near the boundary stones as the afternoon light began to fade. I don't know how to explain it, but it feels like we're being watched. Kale's expression grew serious, his gaze sweeping the tree line with practiced caution. The hunters who spotted our fire, he said. I feared word would travel faster than we hoped. You think the elders know I'm still alive? I think, Kale said carefully, that we should prepare for the possibility that they do, and that men who have protected their power through fear for 2 centuries will not simply allow that fear to unravel without a fight. Silas joined them at the boundary, his weathered face drawn with worry. I have felt it too, these past 2 days. Movement in the lower forest that does not belong to simple hunters passing through. How much time do we have? Elena asked, her pulse quickening with a fear that felt sharper, more immediate, than anything she had experienced since the first night she had been chained to the altar. Not enough, likely, Kale said grimly. If they mean to move against us, they will not wait long once they have confirmed you are here. We should prepare, and we should be ready to protect ourselves, whatever form that protection needs to take. Elena looked toward the darkening tree line, thinking of Garrick's careful gentleness the night he had marched her up this mountain, of the guilt she had glimpsed in his eyes, even as he followed orders he clearly did not agree with. She wondered if he would be among whoever came next, and she wondered, with a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air, whether old loyalty would be enough to stop him from following through on whatever the elders had commanded. Whatever happens, she said quietly, turning back to Kale, I'm not running from this. I came up this mountain to understand the truth, and I'm not going to let fear send me hiding from it now. Not when we're finally this close to breaking the curse and exposing what my family has hidden for 2 centuries. Kale's expression softened slightly, despite the tension gripping his features, something fierce and protective moving behind his golden eyes. Then we face whatever comes together, he said, as we have faced everything else since the night you first spoke your name in that clearing. Above them, the last light faded fully from the sky, and somewhere beyond the dark tree line, the sound of careful, deliberate footsteps began moving steadily up the mountain path, closer with every passing hour. They came at dawn, exactly as Kale had predicted, torches extinguished long before they reached the boundary stones, moving with the practiced quiet of warriors who had trained together for years. Elena watched them emerge from the tree line, from her position near the ruined hall, counting 6 figures in total, Garrick unmistakable among them, even in the dim early light. Elena, Garrick's voice carried across the clearing, careful and measured, though she could hear the tension threaded through it. The elders have sent us to bring you home. If you come peacefully, no one needs to be hurt. Home, Elena repeated, stepping forward despite Kale's hand tightening briefly against her arm in silent warning. You mean the people who chained me to an altar and left me for dead? That home? Garrick's jaw tightened, something like shame flickering across his face before he steadied it. I know how this looks. I know what we did to you was wrong, but Corwin and Edwin believe you may pose a danger to the pack now, aligned with the creature. I need you to come back with me, Elena, before this becomes something none of us can walk away from. The creature, Kale said, stepping forward to stand beside Elena, his voice carrying a weight of old authority that made several of the warriors shift uneasily. Is that truly what your elders have told you I am, Garrick, son of Lucan? I remember your grandfather. He served in my personal guard, before Aldrich Voss convinced the court that betrayal was wiser than loyalty. Confusion flickered across Garrick's face. You know my family? I know every family that stood loyal to me before this mountain became my prison, Kale said. Your grandfather died trying to warn others of what Aldrich intended. His courage was erased from every story your elders have told since, replaced with fear of a monster that was never real. Doubt crept visibly into Garrick's expression, though he did not lower the weapon at his side. Even if that's true, I have my orders. The council has decided. The council has decided to protect a lie their families built 2 centuries ago through betrayal. Elena cut in, stepping fully into view now, her voice steady despite the fear still coiled tight in her chest. Corwin and Edwin's ancestors helped conspire against their own king, Garrick. I've seen the records. I've seen the truth they've spent 200 years burying, and I'm not going back down that mountain to let them silence it again. One of the other warriors shifted uneasily. She's lying, trying to turn you against your orders. I'm not lying, Elena said fiercely. Ask yourselves why the pack has never questioned why the same handful of families have held every council seat for generations. Ask yourselves why no sacrifice sent up this mountain was ever allowed to return and tell their story, until now. The tension in the clearing thickened, warriors exchanging uncertain glances, old loyalty warring visibly against the doubt Elena's words had planted. It was Garrick who finally broke the silence, his shoulders sagging slightly under the weight of a decision he had clearly been fighting since the moment Corwin had given his order. I watched your family look away, while we dragged you from your bed, he said quietly, looking at Elena directly for the first time since arriving. I have not been able to forget that, no matter how many times I told myself I was simply following necessary orders. If there's truth in what you're saying, if the elders have been protecting a lie this entire time, I need to know before I do anything further tonight that I cannot take back. Before Elena could respond, a sharper voice cut through the tense standoff. Enough talk. Edwin stepped out from behind the warriors, his sharp features set with cold determination, a small group of additional fighters trailing behind him that Elena had not accounted for. I told Corwin sending Garrick alone would invite exactly this kind of hesitation, he said, his eyes fixed coldly on Elena. It seems I was right to insist on accompanying this expedition myself. Edwin, Cale said, his voice dropping into something low and dangerous. I remember your ancestor's face far too clearly. The resemblance is remarkable. Save your ghost stories for someone who fears them, Edwin snapped, though something flickered uneasily behind his eyes at Cale's words. Whatever games you've been playing with this girl, whatever lies you've fed her about ancient conspiracies, they end tonight. The Voss girl returns with us, one way or another. She isn't going anywhere she doesn't choose to go, Cale said, and Elena felt the air around him shift, a pressure building that made her skin prickle with awareness. Edwin's expression twisted with something between fear and fury. Take her, he barked at the warriors flanking him. Now, before this thing decides to interfere. Chaos erupted in the clearing as several warriors surged forward. Garrick, to Elena's shock and relief, did not move to intercept her, instead turning to block one of Edwin's fighters with his own body, buying precious seconds even as confusion and violence spread through the ranks around him. Cale's transformation happened faster than Elena had ever witnessed, his human shape tearing away in an instant as the massive black wolf surged forward between her and the advancing warriors. A sound tearing from his throat that was not quite a roar and not quite a howl, something ancient and commanding that made even Edwin's most determined fighters stumble back several steps. Elena felt something inside her respond instinctively to the danger, the same warmth she had felt easing Cale's pain around the fire, now surging forward with startling urgency. Without fully understanding what she was doing, she pressed both palms against the nearest boundary stone, feeling the old, carved symbols beneath her fingers thrum with sudden recognition, as though the stone itself had been waiting 2 centuries for exactly this moment. Light erupted from the boundary stones in a slow, spreading wave, pale gold and achingly familiar from the vision she had glimpsed weeks before, and Elena understood, with sudden clarity, exactly what the witch's ancient condition had been waiting for all along. Not forced blood, not a sacrifice taken from her, a choice, freely made, in the moment it mattered most. I choose this, Elena said aloud, her voice steady despite the chaos surrounding her, despite Cale's massive form fending off warriors only paces away, despite Edwin's furious shouting cutting through the clearing. I choose to stand against what my family built. I choose Cale, freely, without anyone forcing my hand. The ground beneath the clearing trembled, and the ancient light pouring from the boundary stones surged brighter, wrapping around Kale's wolf form in threads of pale gold that seemed to pull directly from the silver scars marking his fur. Kale let out a sound of pained surprise, staggering briefly before straightening, and Elena watched in stunned amazement as the silver markings along his fur began to fade, dissolving like frost beneath sudden sunlight. Edwin's fighters froze, staring at the spreading light with open fear, several already backing toward the tree line despite his furious orders to press forward. "This changes nothing," Edwin shouted, though his voice had lost much of its earlier confidence. "Take the girl, now, before." He did not finish the sentence. The light surged one final time, and Kale's wolf form dissolved back into his human shape at the center of the brightness, standing tall and unburdened, in a way Elena had never seen him stand before, every trace of strain gone from his posture, his golden eyes blazing with a power that had clearly been suppressed for far too long. 200 years, Kale said, his voice carrying an authority that silenced even Edwin's remaining bravado. "Your families kept me trapped on this mountain, fed by lies and fear you built to protect stolen power. That ends tonight." Edwin stumbled back several steps, finally understanding, far too late, exactly what he had walked into. "The curse," Elena breathed, staring at Kale in wonder as the light slowly faded from the boundary stones around them. "It's broken. You're free." Kale turned to her, something raw and overwhelmed moving across his face, centuries of suppressed strength and long-buried hope finally settling into place. "Because of you," he said quietly. "Because you chose, freely, exactly as the witch's condition demanded, in the one moment it truly mattered." Around them, the remaining warriors lowered their weapons, uncertainty and awe replacing whatever violence Edwin had hoped to command from them, and Garrick stepped forward from the chaos, breathing hard but unharmed, his eyes fixed on Kale, with something like recognition dawning slowly across his features. "You truly are him," he said quietly. "The Alpha King from my grandfather's stories." "I am," Kale said, drawing himself up to his full, commanding height, the last shadows of 2 centuries of suffering finally falling away from his bearing. "And it is time this pack learned the truth of exactly what was taken from them, and exactly who has been protecting that theft for far too long." Edwin's remaining warriors backed further away, and Edwin himself stood frozen at the edge of the clearing, the weight of 200 years of carefully maintained power crumbling visibly around him with nowhere left to run. Word of what happened on the mountain reached the village before the sun had fully risen. Edwin returned first, stripped of the confidence he had carried up the slope only hours earlier, and by the time Kale descended the mountain path with Elena at his side, and Garrick's small group of warriors walking respectfully behind them, rather than surrounding them as captors, the entire village had already gathered in the square, drawn by rumors too strange to ignore. Corwin stood at the front of the crowd, his face pale as he watched the Alpha King his family had spent 2 centuries pretending was a mindless monster, walk calmly into the village at the head of a small procession, unmistakably human, unmistakably in full command of himself, and unmistakably furious. "This is not possible," Corwin said, though his voice lacked its usual commanding certainty. "The cursed wolf cannot leave the mountain. The binding is broken," Kale said, his voice carrying easily across the silent square. "Thanks to a choice freely made, by someone your family tried very hard to erase before she ever had the chance to learn the truth." Elena stepped forward, meeting her mother's stunned gaze across the crowd, her father's shocked silence, the faces of neighbors and friends who had watched her marched away weeks earlier, without a single word raised in her defense. She felt no satisfaction in their shock, only a quiet, steady resolve to finally speak the truth this pack had been denied for 2 centuries. "My ancestor, Aldrich Voss, betrayed his own king," she said, her voice clear and unwavering. "He conspired with allies whose families still sit on this council today, cursing a fair ruler and replacing him with a story built entirely on fear, so that their own descendants could inherit power they never earned honestly. I have seen the records. I have seen the truth this council has spent 200 years hiding from every one of you." Murmurs spread through the crowd, uncertainty and disbelief mixing with something else. something that had been quietly building beneath the surface of this pack for far longer than anyone had likely admitted even to themselves. "She lies," Corwin said, though the words came out weaker than he clearly intended. "Whatever this creature has done to twist her mind." "I have twisted nothing," Cale said, stepping forward with quiet, devastating authority. "I offer only truth, and I offer this pack a choice. Your elders never gave any of the sacrifices sent to that mountain before Elena. You may continue believing whatever comfortable lie has been fed to you for 2 centuries, or you may finally learn what was truly taken from your ancestors, and decide for yourselves what justice looks like, now that the truth stands before you." The crowd's uncertain murmur grew louder, and for the first time in longer than Elena could remember, she watched something shift in the faces around her, fear giving way slowly to anger. Not directed at the mountain, not directed at the creature they had spent generations dreading, but at the men who had stood before them for years, claiming authority, built on a foundation of carefully maintained lies. It took days for the full truth to settle over the pack, for the records Elena and Cale had gathered to be shared openly, studied, argued over, and ultimately accepted by enough voices that Corwin and Edwin's positions became untenable. There was no violence in their removal, no vengeance carried out in Cale's name, only a slow, deliberate unraveling of power that had never rightfully belonged to their families in the first place. Cale did not seek to rule the pack the way he once had centuries earlier, though many, Garrick included, quietly began referring to him once more by the title his birthright had always carried. Instead, he worked alongside a newly reformed council, one built from families like Garrick's, whose loyalty had never wavered, even when silenced by fear and convenient stories, ensuring that whatever power remained in this territory would never again rest so completely in the hands of those willing to build it on betrayal. Elena's own family struggled to find their place in the new order that followed, her mother's guilt evident in every hesitant glance, her father's silence now carrying the weight of shame rather than simple avoidance. Elena did not fully forgive them, not quickly, not easily, but she found, standing now firmly in a life she had chosen rather than one forced upon her, that she no longer needed their approval to know her own worth. On a clear evening several weeks later, Elena stood once more in the ruined hall that had first sheltered her after that terrible night at the altar, though the ruins looked different now, less like a tomb, and more like the beginning of something being carefully, deliberately rebuilt. Silas moved among the old stones nearby, humming quietly to himself as he sorted through supplies gathered from villagers eager to help restore what had been lost. Atonement offered freely now instead of fear paid reluctantly. Cale found her watching the stars through the open roof, the same broken ceiling that had once framed her first terrified night on this mountain, now simply beautiful in the quiet evening light. "You are thinking about that first night," he said, coming to stand beside her, no longer carrying the visible strain that had marked every moment of his human form before. "I am," Elena admitted. "I keep thinking about how certain I was that it was the worst night of my life, chained to that altar, waiting for some monster to end everything." "And now?" Cale asked quietly, reaching for her hand. Elena laced her fingers through his, feeling none of the strange, jolting energy that had first passed between them in the ruined hall. Only warmth now, steady and familiar. "Now I think it might have been the best thing that ever happened to me," she said, even though it didn't feel that way at the time. Cale drew her closer, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead as the stars wheeled slowly overhead, and for the first time in 2 centuries, the mountain that had once been a prison of fear and betrayal stood quiet and peaceful beneath a sky finally free of old curses. "The pack that abandoned you once will spend a long time learning what it truly lost that night," Cale said softly. "But I intend to spend considerably longer than that, showing you exactly what it means to finally be chosen, rather than sacrificed." Elena smiled, leaning into him fully, as the last of the evening light faded into a clear, endless night. "Then I suppose we have plenty of time to figure the rest of it out together." Below them, in the village that had once feared this mountain above all else, lights burned steadily in windows late into the night, no longer lit in dread of what the darkness might demand, but simply in the quiet, ordinary comfort of a pack, finally free to rebuild itself honestly, guided at last by a king who had never stopped being worthy of his crown, and a queen who had turned the worst night of her life into the beginning of everything that mattered most.